Time is an ocean in which an island floats. Around the island's shores, darkness gathers from every direction. Black waters rising, eating away at the edges, drawing inwards. Where the Black Sea touches, land falls away, drops faster and faster into the abyss, stretching towards the heart of the nothingness below. A stand of twisted pines is swallowed on one side, a grassy knoll on the other. Shadows roll like gentle waves across a ravine, a brook, through forests and glades, gathering, finally, around the base of a hill. All else has been consumed. The waters continue to rise quickly, then slow, falter, finally halting just before the summit. On this last bit of land she sits, unmoving, knees drawn up to her chin, arms locked round shins, in the center of a small patch of green grass the shape of a woman's body. Words fill her mind, and she shivers, drawing herself tighter. "I will love you," they whisper. Forever. At the height of his popularity, the death artist schedules a performance for the first full moon in the month of August. He has purchased the Eagle Dome in the heart of the city center, boasting a seating capacity of 80,000. The show is sold out. In part, he has financed this purchase through a sale of television rights, though how he has managed the balance of this enormous sum remains a mystery. Many believe he is secretly funded by the government. One of his earliest performances occurred 3 years ago when, prior to the city father's annual motorcade, he slipped a rope around the mayor's bumper, then worked the other end into a noose which he placed around his neck. When asked, he will only say he remembers that day because the sky was the color of a cracked drinking glass. The field is empty, the goalposts have been removed, and the artificial turf has been painted green. Some think this last touches his sense of humor, others are bewildered. Enthusiasm runs high, though it is generally held he will have some difficulty meeting the expectations he has excited. Another highly regarded work was his Death in a Fishbowl, played at the now-defunct Verity Theater, during which he placed a miniature replica of Houdini's glass-walled tank over his head, then filled it from a series of pictures. Before sealing the lid, he added 2 goldfish. Today, he is dressed not in his usual modest attire, rather he wears preposterously long and narrow shoes, balloon pants that billow around him in the slightest breeze, a white shirt covered in large purple and green polka dots and whose buttons are mismatched. Around his neck he sports a large black bow tie, and on his head a puinta capitul. His face is grease paint white, his ears oversized, and on his nose it appears he wears a red rubber ball, though later it is revealed his features have been surgically altered. Perhaps his best remembered performance was a more lingering death than anyone had yet dared. For 4 weeks he lay in a pavilion in the heart of Funerary Park, injected hourly with a different and equally fatal disease. When pressed as to why he had not focused on a single malady, he replied, "One body may contain all the suffering we know." 6 mirrors, each 6 meters square and silvered on either side, have been brought in on the back of a truck. 3 workmen, with the aid of a small boom and winch, placed the first on the ground in the center of the playing field. Sides are then erected. In an hour the cube is completed. The death artist is sealed in. Scholars have argued at great length over the meanings of his deaths. In the end, the only thing upon which they can agree is that there is meaning. They, too, were required to purchase tickets for the final performance. 2 more hours and the stadium is deserted. I hated her more than I hated Pierre. Pierre, now he was clear, easy to see. His beauty was his simplicity, his purity of thought and purpose. Sure, you hated the bastard, but you had to admire him, too, scrambling across the rugged, uneven hills of what the poor deluded asshole thought was his own country, using 20-year-old weapons against our stare self-targeting assault rifles, wearing those ridiculous nationalist uniforms as if they were a shield that would protect him against anything, though they were no hell on stopping our flechettes. Yeah, he was stupid all right, but straight as you can get. You and he knew each other better than you've ever known anybody else, because that's the test. That's the only real test, putting yourself there with the few other assholes who dare, believing in something stupid like your own country in a world that doesn't believe in anything anymore. That's the kind of stupidity that's worth admiring, that's worth having. Daring those crosshairs to shake your belief, challenging that trigger finger to squeeze you out of your resolve, welcoming that round as if it was a special lover, not just a dumb lay like Sheikah. Now, don't get me wrong. Sheikah's out there all alone on point. And she's lasted for over 3 months, not an easy thing to do. She's as mean as they come, her pinched-up little face wagging back and forth as she hunts, her body small and low to the ground, swaying from side to side as she shuffles from cover to cover. I've seen her grease more than her share of Pierre's, and it's weird, because she really hates them, not with my distant, admiring kind of hate, but personal, like they all did something awful to her last night in the woodshed, and now she's going to make the bastards pay and pay and pay. You gotta appreciate all that slow, seething hate walking up front for you, a giant scythe sweeping your path clear. She was that way when I met her back in basic 18 months ago, a nasty piece of business, breathing dark anger, ready to explode. I was glad when our orders came, and I thought I'd seen the last of her. She going off up north to Shibugamo, where there was lots of heavy shit happening, while I pulled soft duty down south in the valley. I never expected to see her again, but I did. I remember when she transferred in, sitting across from me in the barracks, studying me when she thought I wasn't watching her, sharpening that long knife she always carried in her boot, running it up and down that whetstone, looking as if she was wondering how much of an edge she'd have to put on it to slice right through my neck with one stroke. Seeing her again that day, I felt something inside me tighten up, and I knew I hated her still, even though she has saved my life every day since, just by being there, walking the point, rolling her hatred in front of her like a boulder. We'd drawn recon patrol again, another hot spot in the foothills of the Laurentians. Why us? Why always send us into the worst possible shit? We drew this kind of stuff twice as much as any other squad. It was like somebody back at HQ had it in for us. But if it troubled anyone else in our squad, they didn't complain. Instead, they seemed to like it, too. Savor the opportunity to raise our kill ratio. We were strung out in a ragged line. I caught sight of Chica about 10 meters ahead and a little too far to my left, so I picked up the pace, edging back in her direction. Occasionally I could see Angela between us, flitting in and out of cover, pale and wraith-like, difficult to spot, bending tree and shrub to her will, folding them around her like a cloak. Behind me there was Cash, then, in the middle of the pack, Sarge with his little dog, Trembly. I could never quite figure out what Trembly's story was, a clean-shaven regular army guy, betraying nothing, not really part of the unit, an observer, as Sarge called him, always scribbling in those little blue notebooks he carried around, attached to us in some way that was never made quite clear. Observing God knows what, as he hunted his own people. It gave me the creeps whenever he was behind me, like he was observing me personally, even though there wasn't a goddamn thing I could think of that was worth observing. We moved downhill, and the tree cover thinned a bit, then turned into a stand of birches, branches arching overhead to form a canopy. We broke into a copse. It was quiet and beautiful, flanked with thick undergrowth that looked like it had been cultivated, the duff soft and yielding under outboots, a shaft of sunlight slanting through the gap in the tree cover and into our eyes. Nice spot, I thought, for an ambush. Then Pierre hit us. I was knocked off my feet the instant they opened up, half a dozen slugs hammering into my flak jacket, their AK-47s making it awful racket. I rolled on the ground, wheezing and gasping, trying to catch the breath that had been hammered from my lungs, fighting off the sharp pain of what I figured was a broken rib or two. Beside me, Cash lay on the ground, blood oozing from a hole in his throat, eyes open, dead as dead can get. I heard shouts over the gunfire, some I recognized, some I didn't. Heavy boots stamped on the ground, crashing through the underbrush, then the muffled thump of low-yield ordnance, mostly smoke it seemed, to confuse and hide. But I wasn't scared. I didn't even care if I'd been hit. The only thing I felt was anger at being on the ground, at the incompetence of Pierre not killing me when he had the chance. I wanted to make the bastard pay for his mistake. Gritting my teeth, I pushed myself to my feet, my stare cradled in my fists, and gasped as pain spiked my ribs. Again, my eyes teared up. I blinked until my vision cleared. Gunfire had become sporadic, the confusion and smoke still making it difficult to know who to kill. Now, an occasional burst, sounds moving off in the left. Though I couldn't be sure, I guessed that Pierre had more or less hightailed it. Sarge and the rest of the squad chasing after him. I was alone, or thought I was. Danby had been standing so still I hadn't noticed him. But there he was, off to my right, his piece gone, his eyes glassy, unfocused. Seeing something I couldn't, seeing somewhere else, staring, maybe, at the place he'd rather be. About to walk. I'd seen it before, seen maybe a dozen or more in my last two Squads. It was always the same. They'd pull their leads, drop their weapons, and disappear quietly. Into the bush, following Pierre mostly, sometimes just wandering off. Going God knows where, thinking God knows what. Even the ones brought back were blanks, shells, their brains wiped clean of anything. But this need to walk, as if they didn't know anything anymore except how to put one foot in front of the other, step after goddamn step. Sometimes we'd find them, walkers, who'd walked until they couldn't walk any farther because they fell into a ravine and broke a leg or turned an ankle on a root or something lying therein. The dirt, covered with scratches and cuts where branches and twigs had whipped their faces, usually dead, but not always, sometimes. Legs still pushing against the ground, digging little channels in the earth, moving them forward, inch by terrible inch. The army says walkers are Pierre's doing, some kind of bioengineered stuff, a virus maybe, though they haven't isolated it. Yet even though they've had 2 years and hundreds of walkers to experiment on, the masks and suits they used to give us didn't seem to be any damn good, and after a few weeks we gave up on them. All they know is that once you've got it, you're gone. There's no return. Irreversible cortical damage, meaning it eats away at your brain until you're nothing but a vegetable, an empty husk where someone used to live. And there was Danby, his piece gone, his eyes glassy with that look walkers get, me watching him, not offing him right then and there like I was supposed to, the way it said in our orders, because there was something wrong. A weird nagging feeling that told me this wasn't right. He wasn't going anywhere fast, so I just moved my rifle along, keeping it trained on him, thinking it odd, not Danby at all, that there was something really out of whack, because he was nothing like those other poor dreamy bastards I'd seen walk. Nothing like them at all. Sure, he was crazy as a loon, but he just wasn't the type, he just didn't have the smell. None of us did in this squad. And I realized maybe that was it. He was the first walker since they'd cobbled together our squad 6 months ago. In that time I'd almost forgotten about walking. I tightened my finger on the trigger, about to waste him, thinking, oh well, there goes our perfect record. And I was on the ground, the trees above me spinning out of control, my head pounding and my ears ringing so loud I couldn't hear a thing. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that only made it worse, so I opened them. Chica was standing over me, rifle balanced in one hand, its muzzle almost touching my nose, her fingers still inside the trigger. Guard. She wasn't looking at me, she was watching something else that I couldn't see. I wondered what she could be watching in a sort of detached, dreamy way, as if it really wasn't me there, getting this weird feeling that it was important that I know what she was so intent on. So I thought hard even though my head still pounded. Then I remembered Danby. She must have been watching him, I realized, the crazy little bitch, staring at him with this puzzled expression on her screwed up face, an expression I'd never seen her wear before. And that's all she did, even though she knew letting walkers go meant court-martial. Still doing nothing, just watching, while I concentrated on a tendon in her forearm moving in and out as she ran her finger up and down that hair trigger. But she didn't squeeze it, only stood there, as Danby wandered off into the bush. She looked after him for a moment, long after he must have been gone, then turned suddenly to stare at me, her eyes burning with something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't quite place. Staring along the barrel of her weapon right into my face. A long dark stare that nailed me where I was. Like she wanted something, not begging or pleading, but insisting on an answer from me. Then she was gone. Faster than you could imagine anyone moving, without sound or motion, just gone, leaving me there on the ground, head pounding. Pain searing my side, scared that maybe I had just answered her question without meaning to. When we got back, all of Danby's stuff was gone. His locker cleared out, his pictures taken down, like he'd never been there at all. The next day a stiff was waiting for us, a lieutenant colonel, straight from HQ, to give us the drill, wanting to know who saw Danby, what happened when he'd gone, what he said just before going, how he looked, the whole routine, asking his stupid questions over and over, making my brain ache so bad I had to close my eyes and put my head in my hands, my fingers feeling the big lump on the back of my neck. It was all wrong, and they knew it somehow. Danby bothered them more than he should have, more than it had ever bothered them before. With my other outfits, some pencil pusher had shown up with the standard forms, 10 minutes, talking to the mic. Thank you very much, done. But this time it was different, more important, and Colonel Stiff was really annoyed. It bothered me, too, though I didn't say anything then, because that'd be inviting trouble. Something was really cracked about this whole thing. Sheikah giving me strange looks ever since, and that poor Angela, too, whenever I saw them together, as they were most of the time now, whispering to each other. Before Danby, there had been some silent stream connecting them, an underground movement they shared for God knows what reason, maybe because they were the only two women in the squad. But now, since Danby, they'd become inseparable, day and night, together every moment, like lovers or something. Why did it all of a sudden start to get under my skin? I mean, I hated Sheikah more than all these other sorry bastards, a trained performer, doing her duty without feeling or remorse, killing efficiently and without respect for those she killed in any way she could, cool and machine-like, Pierre an insect to be crushed beneath her heel. And Angela was just a big nothing, an empty space, in danger of being blown away by the next stiff breeze. It rattled you. The way she appeared and disappeared without a sound, even around the barracks, almost as if she wasn't really there. The one, hard-end, predatory, a slow, careful, unforgiving stalker, the other a phantom, a waking dream, smoke. Angela and Sheikah. I ignored them, but it gave me the creeps anyway. And for once I agreed. Everyone was right to be all worked up, because there was definitely something wrong, something about this outfit that made it wrong to do what Danby did. I opened my eyes. It was dark and the ground was cold and hard beneath my thin sheets, and I knew I wasn't alone. You rolled over. Sheikah hung over me, a gargoyle in the moonless dark rain, dripping down that long nose of hers to splash on my face. Did you tell them? I didn't say anything. Did you tell them? She hissed at me again. Tell them what? About Danby? I shook my head. She squatted there next to me in the cold and wet, her face a crumpled map of shadows and broken edges, her hooded eyes no longer focused on mine, but staring now at an invisible place. Sheikah? She looked startled, as if she'd forgotten I was there. Then she got this weird look in her eyes. I want to know, she said suddenly. Know what, Sheikah? In basic, a pretty boy like you could have had anyone. Why me? Why'd you sleep with me? The question caught me off guard. I looked up at her, at that ugly, deformed little face with its hard lines and unforgiving angles. I started to say, I heard you gave good head, or I didn't have enough energy for a struggle. But for some reason the words stuck in my throat, wouldn't come out with that little face poking right into mine. Dunno, I said instead, shrugging, trying to sound unconcerned. Uninterested. She peered at me intently, and I could feel her reaching deep down into me, trying to find the real reason, trying to pull it out. I looked away. Honest to God, I don't. She blinked once, twice, then began to push herself off her haunches. Sheikah? She stopped and looked at me, my heart thumped beneath the weight of my rain-soaked fatigues. Why don't you stay here tonight? She bit her lower lip, then shook her head slowly from side to side. Why not? I was surprised at the sudden surge of anger I felt at the rising volume of my words. Is it because of that bitch, Angela? Is it? She shrugged. No, she said, simply, quietly, with the same finality with which I'd once seen her slice open the throat of it. Anduki Pierre. She shifted her weight slightly, showing me what I hadn't seen before, the dull metallic gleam of the knife in her hand. You weren't so choosy back in basic, I said, watching the cold rain run off the tip of that blade. Neither were you. Fuck you, I said, trying not to let my voice shake, still watching that knife, hunkering back beneath my tarp and away from the rain. Go back to your Angela. Without a word, she slipped the knife into her boot and stood up, poncho-less and insensible to the rain. Yeah, she said, I will. And as she strode off into the darkness, it felt as if she had somehow stolen part of me, taken it with her so that I would never be whole again. Another week passed and we managed to stay clear of each other. It wasn't until we were on recon, 2 days out, cold and tired, and bored in the hills north of Lac Saint Jean, that we spoke again. We'd been humping through terrain worn down by ages of erosion, covered by enormous pine and fir. There hadn't been much action in the last few weeks, just some hit-and-run stuff, nothing important. We hadn't even had a casualty, though we had to smoke some nationalists out of an abandoned shack a few days ago. They were hungry and ragged, and the poor bastards almost looked grateful. But to command 1 Pierre meant 100 more, so they sent us up into the hills to check it out. chasing after imaginary units because there was nothing better to do. I was supposed to be doing a wide sweep on our eastern flank, but I dragged my ass west instead, over towards where Angela was. Patrolling because my neck had been itching all morning, a light, persistent tingling, telling me to go over there. It took me about half an hour to work my way round to where I guessed she was. It would have been much faster, but she had her gift, and though my neck itched wildly, urging me on, telling me I was headed the right way, I wasn't sure I could get close enough to the bitch without stepping on her first. So I went slowly, carefully, passing as silently as I could from shadow to shadow, and almost stumbled when I caught sight of Angela. She was standing beside a shallow creek, the sun beating down on her, no cover nearby, rifle and helmet at her feet, her thin hair not braided, but out and hanging down between those narrow shoulders, strands moving slightly in the breeze. I was a good 20 meters away, and I knew she was about to walk then, because if she wasn't, she'd have known by now I watched her and would have vanished before I could do anything. Instead, she stood there, solid, more substantial than I'd ever seen her look before, staring north. I imagined her eyes, big and round and unfocused, great big pie-in-the-sky eyes, a walker's eyes. I raised my rifle and sighted, thinking, strangely, not about her, but about Sheikah, hard, unbreakable Sheikah, while I waited for those first few steps, for my chance to fire. Sheikah, like the callus on my thumb, dead and tough and unfeeling. Maybe, just maybe, I thought, I won't wait for her to take that first step. I caressed the trigger as if it were a charm, pulling it back ever so slowly, savoring the moment, tasting its satisfaction, then froze, became stone, as dead still as I could, because my itch was back and shouting, "Don't move, don't breathe," telling me behind you. So I turned, slowly as I could, centimeter by centimeter, till I could see what I knew would be there, Sheikah, her piece pointed at me, its muzzle making small hypnotic arcs, a snake about to strike, needing only the smallest of pressure from her finger to stitch across my stomach. Beside her lay Trembly, his throat cut cleanly, blood still trickling onto last autumn's leaves beneath him. She had this insane look in those hard, gray eyes, like she'd lost it or something. But I knew it wasn't that, couldn't be that, with her standing the way she was. And then I thought, I'm going to die, and began shaking, though I'd never been scared before. I wanted to talk to her, to tell her. What? I wasn't sure. Chica, I had this crazy urge to say to her, to those mad eyes staring through me, fixing me where I stood, a bug with a pin in it. But nothing came out. Then she fired. She didn't blink, those eyes of hers, never took them off mine. Just squeezed off the burst that brought Angela down in mid-stride. As she stepped into the brook, tearing through her back and spraying out her front with her guts, shattering a small tree on the other side of the stream. Sheikah closed her eyes, then, at last, and turned and walked away. Unhurriedly, not bothering to duck and weave as she'd always done. Out here in the bush, but straight up and stiff-legged, like it was something she hadn't done in a long time, something she wasn't used to doing. I waited outside. She'd been hustled right in, still in her fatigues and recon gear, while I hung around outside the barracks, across from the mess hall, where they took her, stripping my piece, meticulously cleaning and laying each part on a small sheet of plywood I'd found nearby, cleaning and waiting to see if she'd come out, to see if they'd call me in. People came and went, clerks and officers, even the CO, and the same stiff from HQ, who'd been here when Danby walked. What would she tell them about Trembly and Angela? What could she tell them? I waited until it got late and the lights went on in the mess, but they never called for me and she never came out. Did you like Angela? It was dark in the barracks and I could barely hear the whisper, but I knew right away who it was. Like her? Shit, I didn't even know her. How the hell could I like her? Sitting on Danby's bunk, I could make out Sheikah's squat form, and though I couldn't see her face, her shoulders looked tired and hunched. I liked her, she said. I felt a sudden stab of anger. Then why'd you waste her? I could feel her coil, as if she were about to come at me. But she didn't. Instead, she answered, because she loved me, just like that. I thought then that she had snapped, had lost it, that all this shit they'd piled on us had finally made her go over the edge, that maybe she really was insane. She asked me to, she said, when I didn't say anything, and it sounded like she was asking for my forgiveness. She made me promise, and I did. Yeah, I said stupidly, 'cause she said she loved me. We both sat there in the dark for a minute before her voice came to me softly again. We're special, you know. Special? Yeah, special. She shifted her weight and I could hear the bunk creak. It sounded loud, and I wondered if anyone else was awake, listening to this. You should know that. You've been here since the beginning. Can't you see we're special? I don't see anything special about us, I whispered to her. We're just a bunch of shit kickers, Sheikah, too much trouble on our own maybe. So they stick us together, you know, to minimize the problems. Yeah, maybe. Maybe. Why do you think the brass is so pissed off? This squad isn't supposed to have walkers. That's why. I didn't know it before Danby walked, but when he did, I knew it wasn't right. You know? It didn't fit. It wasn't supposed to happen. Somewhere down inside me, I could feel muscles tightening. Yeah, so what? We've all seen our share of walkers. What's the big deal? She shook her head. Don't you see? Nothing happens by accident. In the army, nothing. It's that way because they wanted it to be that way. Understand? No, D. Don't be an asshole, she hissed at me. All you gotta do is watch. Why do you think they're making this stink? It's cause we're their prize guinea pigs, or were until this. I could hear pain in her voice, and it startled me because it was something I'd never thought I'd hear from her. Did you know, she said, me still hearing the strain in that voice of hers, that we've had the best kill ratio for the last 5 months? And not a single walker the whole time. Now this, Danby and Angela, this is making them blow smoke out of their assholes. When I went in there, I thought they were going to crucify me, you know. But they asked hardly anything about Angela, and nothing about old Tremblay. They don't even care about him, just about me. How are you? How did you feel about Angela? Does this upset you? Does this depress you? And on and on and on. And I'm thinking, why are they asking me, you know, and not wondering about why I offed the two of them in the first place? And I start to notice things, the way they keep looking into these little blue notebooks, Tremblay's notebooks, while they ask things and flip through files, thick files, these medical corps guys. They're not doctors, but psychiatrist types, one I remember from a while ago, who interviewed me just before they transferred me here. And get this, one guy even asks, where was Dr. Tremblay while this was happening? Can you believe that shit? Dr. Tremblay? He was a goddamn doctor. Maybe the guy made a mistake, Sheikah. No, he didn't. Cause the others looked at him sharp, like he'd fucked up bad, not like he'd made a little mistake. The way she said it, I knew she believed. No, he knew what he was saying, cause they're the ones that put Tremblay there in the first place, to watch us, to spy on us, to take his notes. They're the ones that put us together, you, me, Angela, Danby, Cash, all of us, even Sarge. Why? Why us? She shrugged. Who knows? She leaned forward until her head almost touched mine. Maybe it's cause we're all sick twists? She said slowly, carefully watching how I'd react, but I didn't move a muscle. Maybe we're like puzzles with a piece missing, the thing that makes walkers want to walk. Maybe something inside of us is stunted or not there, and so we can't walk. Or at least that's what the army thought. It was my turn to shrug. An awful lot of maybes, I said. She studied my face for a moment, then asked, why do you hate yourself? A jagged flash of anger blinded me, and I began to rise. But before I could lift myself, Sheikah was on me, knocking my arms out from under me and pinning me to the bed, folding me in my sheets as if it were a cocoon. I struggled, letting out a wordless cry of frustration as I lay tangled in the sheets, but it was useless, and so I let myself go. Limp, forcing myself to be calm, letting the rage leach away. She made a strange sound then, a dog bark, and it was a moment before I recognized it for what it was, a laugh. We're part of the experiment, she said. Their search for that missing piece that'll stop Pierre's fever. We hate ourselves so much we can't think of anything else but dying. We're the exact sort they wanted, cause we conditioned ourselves better than they ever coulda. They laid out a pattern of suppressing fire around us that chewed up great big chunks of earth and showered them down on our heads. It sounded like an old Gustav launcher with anti-tank rounds because of the way they detonated only after burrowing into the ground. Using it now seemed absurd, ludicrous, the same as killing an ant with a howitzer. An awful lot of trouble, an awful waste of energy, too. Use it on us, so unlike Pierre's normal sparing use of ordnance. What could he be thinking? Crawling a few meters, I peeked over the lip of the crater and tried to spot their placement where they dug in on the hillside, but it was hard to see because it was buried deep in the trees and creeping shadows. I looked quickly to either side, curious more than for any other reason, wondering what had happened to the other squad that was with us, but couldn't see much of anything except for a few big holes where the shells had struck, an uprooted tree, and twisted and burned pieces of debris. I let myself slide back down into the crater next to Sheikah, Pettis, and what was left of Sarge. Well, Pettis asked, calm as always. See anything? Nah. Pettis nodded, idly moving a piece of Sarge back and forth with the toe of his boot. He didn't look scared at all, just kind of aware for a change. That sleepy look gone from his face, at peace I guess, as if he'd settled something with himself. He smiled at me, and I looked at him, his young face red and scrubbed, and realized I've never looked closely at him before, never really looked at any of them. Well, he said, I guess I'd better get going. He smiled again, a warm knowing smile, and winked, crazy bastard, winked at us. He crawled to the edge of the crater, teetered on the brink for a moment, then was gone. Sheikah stared at the sky, lying there on her back, but still wouldn't look at me. I heard the distant sound of first one, then two semis opening up, and the distinctive reply of Pettis's piece. One of the semis suddenly fell silent, then the other, and all was quiet again. A moment later, the ground rocked with the impact of another strike not too far off. A dull thud and whistling of fragments followed by a shower of dirt and small stones. I brushed the crap from where it had fallen on Sheikah's face. She shivered, pulling her arms tighter around her bloodied stomach, as if she believed that might stop her insides from spilling out through those gaping holes. I didn't know why she wasn't already dead. She should have died half an hour ago when she first caught the fragment. Fuck it, she hissed through gritted teeth. Fuck it all. I heard the thump of another shell, close this time, and leaned over to shield her as dirt and small rocks pattered around us. Something sharp striking my back and bouncing away. The shower ended, and the silence was broken once more only by Sheikah's ragged breathing. Why are you here? The question was hard to hear, coming as it did, whispered, throaty, through tightly clenched lips, through her pain. I shrugged and rolled over onto my back next to her, the two of us staring up at the autumn sky like a couple of goofy kids. I knew it was a good question. I could have gone Pettis's way, maybe broken through even, at the very least, greased a few Pierres for my trouble. Or I could have tried for the forest behind. It was only about 200 meters and a few minutes until darkness, and if I made the cover then they would never have been able to find me. But I stayed. Maybe I've got that death wish you were talking about. No, her voice was weak, but the way she said it I knew she meant it. She started to say something else, to explain herself, maybe, but her lips twisted in a rictus of pain, and her words were choked off. When she began coughing up blood, silence fell then, a breathless calm, and I could hear her struggling to inhale, fighting for each breath, not surrendering a single one, focused entirely on drawing in air, making shattered muscles obey her will, raggedly forcing the oxygen into her torn lungs. It stopped? No, not stopped. Changed. Became quiet, steady, rhythmic, peaceful. Her eyes had a distant, far-away look in them. A walker's look. Her face was no longer hard and angry, just tired, full of sadness, as if for things she couldn't change. She relaxed her grip on her chest, and her arms slipped, bit by bit, down her sides to where they lay, palms up, in the dark earth. I knew then that she would have walked if she could. It seemed to me that her little legs were restless, she wanting nothing more than to push herself to her feet, to get up and walk towards Pierre. But it was too late. She hadn't the strength. So I picked her up, lighter than I'd ever have imagined, as if all that were substantial about her, all that kept her nailed down to the earth, had fled. Only that little wisp of air, a tiny rising and settling of her chest, connecting her still to this world, still to me. I climbed the side of the crater, moving towards Pierre, through the gloom, through the shattered trees and smoke and debris. I walked without thinking, a distant part of me waiting for the sound of those final rounds, the last I knew I would hear, but it didn't seem important. The only important thing now, the small misshapen figure cradled in my arms. And when her breathing finally stopped, I realized I was crying my tears falling down onto her face, leaving little pink trails on her cheeks where they washed away the dust, hearing somewhere in the back of my mind, coming from a different place, a world I no longer belong to, the faraway sound of choppers. 6 months have passed since then. I'm back in the valley now, attached to a unit west of Montreal, training new meat, teaching them what they didn't learn in basic, meaning just about everything. When I look around, their faces seem normal, young and scared and excited all at the same time, but mostly scared, though they wouldn't admit it. They strut around, pretending they're not frightened of anything or anyone, proudly flashing their new hardware as if they were marching in a parade. Every once in a while I catch a glimpse of a face in the crowd with that same hardened look Sheikah wore, and my heart seems to stop. Then, in those moments I can almost convince myself I hate her once again. Hate her for abandoning me, hate her for leaving before I had my chance. I try not to think about it too much, but I know that soon I'll have no other choice, because that day when she took my hatred with her, leaving me with a big empty space inside that I'm going to have to fill somehow. And it's hard to know where to begin. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. You're dead. Peter wagged the damning slips of paper he'd pulled from the toque at Barry. 5 minutes to pack your things and leave the cabin. Barry, the first man overboard. Daniel watched the soon-to-be drowned man, sitting cross-legged on the floor before the hearth, his bulk eclipsing the fire. A thumb-sized wine stain on his shirt, zipper half open, eyeglasses at their usual cant. Naturally, he was the first to go. Barry attempted a smile. Honestly, Peter, he sniffled through his incipient cold, the susurrus of breath whispering from his nose. I just got here. Incredibly, Barry had once been Daniel's lover. Daniel couldn't have said why exactly. Pity, perhaps, or more likely a sense of gratitude. Barry had stuck by him when, some years ago, Daniel had spiraled into an alcoholic despondency, while all his other so-called friends, many of whom now sat in this rough semicircle around the fire, had expertly vanished. You agreed to the rules. We all did. Peter stretched out his long legs, the antithesis of Barry, tall, athletic, handsome in a vaguely dissipate way, dressed in casually expensive clothes of such quality that, as someone had once pointed out, one was expected to recognize them without the benefit of the usual designer labels. I trust you'll see yourself out. It had been Peter's idea. Who else? A game called Lifeboat. Justify your continued presence on a raft in the middle of the ocean, your meager supplies dwindling. Each round of rationalizations to be followed by a vote. You should be thrown overboard. 4 minutes left. But the game itself wasn't the crowning touch. No, it was the group Peter had assembled. He'd lured Daniel and his new boyfriend, Marcus, up here with the promise of a quiet weekend, crowing about the beauty of the countryside, the romance of a rustic cabin. An ideal setting for budding paramours, but said nothing about the others. Daniel scanned the circle of faces and felt nauseous. All his former lovers, a testimonial to his mistakes, to a past poorly spent. Marcus was unaware. He was too young, too new to the community, unacquainted with Daniel's checkered past. And the others seemed oblivious too, ignorant of this connection, perhaps because Daniel had always been discreet in his affairs, except with Peter. Fucking Peter. How could he be doing this? But it'll be dark before I reach the highway. Barry foundered. He raised an arm, running it under his nose and dragging the offending mucus onto the sleeve of his moth-eaten cardigan, spilling a bit of his wine onto the area rug. Peter scowled. Daniel, sickened and embarrassed, looked away. He didn't want to witness this. He wanted Barry gone. Wanted them all gone. Or, better yet, wanted to leave himself with Marcus. But what could he say without looking like a fool? The mob has spoken. Peter held aloft the slips of paper in one hand and the token to which they deposited their votes in the other. 5 for tossing you out of the lifeboat. 3 for Jason. Bitches, Jason hissed. Daniel burned. At Peter. At the game. At being suckered into. Coming up to the cabin. He curled his hands into fists. Fuck Peter. He would leave. And to hell with them all? Daniel felt fingers touch the back of his hand, startling him. Daniel glanced to his left, at Marcus, and went utterly still. Light from the fire played across the planes of Marcus's face. Across sculpted cheekbones, Roman nose, skin as flawless as marble. Christ, he was beautiful. Striking as Michelangelo's David. No, Daniel decided. More striking. Because he was real. Daniel's heart twitched in that miserably cliched way. Love. It embarrassed, mortified, and excited him. It made a hash of his life. How could he, of all people, be in love? 58 years old, a once handsome man in decline, an acknowledged cynic. In love for the first time, with a boy toy half his age. More than Daniel, Peter was skeptical about the notion of love. When Daniel had confided his infatuation with Marcus, Peter had scoffed, mocked him mercilessly, and, had it not been his own miserable heart in a vice, Daniel would have joined in. Yet here he was, stupid as a schoolgirl, in love with Marcus. In love with his youthfulness, his naivete, aching to reclaim that innocence, to forget his misused past. Daniel wanted a new start, a blank slate, tabula rasa, and up here, away from the affectation of the city and its petty concerns, in the clear, bright air of the country, Daniel imagined it might be possible, the two of them walking hand in hand in the breathless winter calm of the forest. Only Peter's malicious game had ruined all that. 3 minutes. Daniel swallowed, suddenly giddy. Barry, somehow on his feet, now trembled in the midst of the circle. He gestured at the front window where large, lazy flakes lit on the pane. Outside, Scotch pines, boughs drooping with accumulated snow, ringed the cabin, an incongruously picturesque scene. I'm not sure I have enough gas to make the highway. Daniel almost laughed. Sorry, old man. Barry searched the ring of faces for an ally. Don't make me go. Daniel watched them, one by one, stare back impassively. Martin first, then his partner Rick, chewing nervously on his fingernails. Kurt, who'd crossed his burly arms, and Jason, who stuck out his tongue. And then Barry turned to Marcus. Daniel caught his breath. 2 pair of eyes, locked. Barry's hopeful, entreating, Marcus's. What? Sympathetic? Impassive? He couldn't tell. Then abruptly Barry was looking at him. Daniel. Shamed, though not sure why, Daniel stared at a fascinating swirl in the rug just beyond the banded toes of his hiking socks. Daniel. I'm sorry. Quietly. Had he even said it aloud? I'll leave in the morning. Barry spoke to Peter this time. When? The snow stops. Daniel looked up. Peter had moved over to the fireplace. One by one he let the slips of paper drift from his hand and into the flames, chanting as each piece flared, No, 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 no. He checked his Rolex. 2 minutes. What if I won't go? Jason sucked in his breath. Chairs creaked as Kurt and Martin sat up. Won't go? Barry refusing? It seemed incomprehensible. Daniel watched Peter for a reaction. Had his face flushed? Or was that a trick of the flickering light? As I see it, you've no choice. I won't. Barry glanced out the window as if there was something out there that unnerved him more than Peter's scorn. He was trembling. I'm not going. Daniel followed his gaze. In the few moments that had passed, clouds had knit overhead, darkness spreading over the trees that circled the cabin, hardening their edges, inking out the gaps between them, making the snow they bore look filthy. 1 minute. You can't make me leave. Yes, I can. Peter flipped open the lid of a vintage cigar box on the mantel. From it he withdrew a small, pearl-handled revolver. Barry stared at the weapon, open-mouthed. Every good lifeboat should be provisioned for all emergencies. Does it really work? Kurt asked, lifting his bulk from his seat, towering over them like a grizzly. You've got to be joking. Rick, perpetually agitated, stood also, pushing past Kurt. Barry looked at him gratefully, as if Rick had just thrown him a lifeline. It's too little to do any real damage. You'll want something bigger. Jason tittered nervously. Barry's fleeting expression of hope collapsed like a cheap tint in a windstorm. Peter waved the pistol towards the door. Time's up. His eyes moving from Peter to the lowering sky outside. Barry edged back, caught between Scylla and Charybdis. You wouldn't shoot me? His expression was akin to that of a rabbit Daniel had once seen, forlornly dragging its crushed hindquarters off the gravel shoulder of a country road into a weed-choked ditch. Peter cocked the gun. Get out. Wait. The word popped out of Daniel's mouth. Peter looked mildly curious. Yes. Let him stay. just for the night. And why should we do that? He's our friend, for God's sake. Your friend. I never much liked him. For God's sake, Peter, if he doesn't make it to the highway, it'd be just like shooting him. Then perhaps I should save him the trip and shoot him right now. Jesus, it's just a game. And it's my fucking cabin. If you don't like the rules, you can leave with him. He sneered. Maybe that's what you'd like to do. Hey, leave with your fat friend. Then if the car breaks down, you two can cuddle to stave off the cold. It's not like you haven't cuddled before. Daniel's cheeks burned. The others stared at him in incredulity. Daniel and Barry? Jason was positively elated. This is too much. Marcus stiffened. He pulled his hand away from Daniel's and turned to stare at the fire. It's not true, Daniel blurted out, struggling to keep his tone light. Jesus. I mean, really. Look at him. The color drained from Barry's face. He seemed to deflate. Daniel felt sickened at his betrayal. He tried to hold Barry's gaze. Couldn't. Barry picked up his parka from a chair and tugged it on. His duffel lay slumped over at his feet. Cinching shut his duffel, Barry hoisted it. The dead weight swung from his hand like a condemned man from the gallows. He opened the door. Wind gusted around the edges of the screen door, rattling it, chilling the room. Barry looked back. Love makes us do cruel things. He spoke to Daniel alone. Then, to everyone else, fuck you all. A blast of icy wind, the slam of the door, and to all a good night. Jason said, laughing too loudly at his own joke. An engine coughed twice, started, snow squeaking under tires. The sound quickly fading, lost in the trees and scrub in the hills. Under the incalculable weight of snow that smothered them. Part of Daniel's past was gone. Despite his self-loathing, he experienced an undeniable surge of relief. Hopeful, he tried to catch Marcus's eye, but Marcus stared resolutely at the fire, his expression set like stone, ignoring Daniel. Jason snorted. Good riddance. He looked to Peter for approval, but Peter merely turned the revolver over in his hand, admiring it, then placed it back in the cigar box and shut the lid. Jason fidgeted. Now that Barry's gone, we don't have to play that stupid game anymore, right? Peter arched his eyebrows slightly in a patrician gesture. Wrong. The next round will be tomorrow morning after breakfast. And we'll have another round after each meal. Surveying the surviving castaways, he smiled. Now, who's for another glass of wine? As Daniel peeled carrots for dinner, Marcus sidled up to him. For a full minute he stood at Daniel's side, silently watching the slivers of orange raining down into the sink. Did you cuddle? Marcus's question was low, almost a whisper. At the other end of the cabin, the rest of the group sat around a folding table in front of the fire, talking, laughing, sipping Chardonnay, and absorbed in a game of whist, the latest megrim of the theater crowd. Barry had been gone less than an hour. What are you talking about? Daniel tried to hide his apprehension, continued the rhythmic slicing, the jangle of the peeler filling the silence. Did you fuck him? No? Then why are your hands shaking? Daniel stopped peeling, rested his hands on the edge of the sink to steady them. For God's sake, we're friends. That's all. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of Peter watching them. He fought to calm himself. You know I'm a jealous person. Marcus said it matter-of-factly, like he was describing his height or hair color. I told you when we first met that I couldn't stand being around you. He hesitated, searching for a word. Your past. It was true. He had almost broken up with Daniel over it. Marcus made no secret of feeling threatened by Daniel's older and more sophisticated friends, especially by his former lovers. The community was lousy with them. They were in nightclubs and restaurants, at the theater. So, after a few awkward incidents, Daniel had steered Marcus away from those places and people, of anything that might jeopardize their relationship. Marcus picked up a small paring knife. The thought of you with Barry makes me crazy. Peter leaned towards them, no doubt straining to hear. Well, we weren't together. Daniel wished it had never happened, could almost convince himself it hadn't. Besides, he's gone. Daniel resumed peeling. He smiled wanly. Drowned. Marcus ran the blade back and forth like a tiny saw along the tip of his finger. Is there anyone else here I need to worry about? Daniel shook his head. He couldn't bring himself to frame a lie in words. You sure? Yes. Okay. Marcus put the knife down. A small cut while blood on the tip of his finger. Marcus stared at it for a moment, then wiped it carelessly on his pants. Leaning forward, he put his hand on Daniel's shoulder, gave him a peck on the cheek, then sauntered over to watch Daniel's ex-lovers play cards. Peter nodded to Marcus, then turned and winked at Daniel. He returned his attention to the card game. Daniel stared at them, the group absorbed in the game, like a small, exclusive club. On his shoulder, a single drop of blood seeped into the fabric of his sweatshirt. Christ, he thought, what a mess. Peter had lined his former lovers up like ducks in a row. And all Daniel could do was wait and hope it came to nothing. His past rushed towards him like a runaway freight train, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. 1 a.m. Only Kurt and Daniel remained up. Everyone else had gone to bed. Outside, relentless flakes of snow obliterated everything. Even the row of cars, parked no more than 10 meters away, had vanished. It was as if they had been walled in. Daniel didn't mind being alone with Kurt. Of them all, he'd been Daniel's most thoughtful lover, steady, gentle, undemanding. And in the big man's contemplative silences, Daniel had always found comfort. Once, Kurt had even declared his love. Why, Daniel wondered, did I end it with him? The answer came to him as soon as he'd framed the question, because he never loved Kurt. He was merely comfortable with him. Can't sleep? Kurt's voice was a low, baritone murmur. It startled Daniel from his reverie. Daniel turned. Kurt stood behind him holding the slim volume of poetry he'd been leafing through. The faint odor of scotch was unmistakable. A touch of insomnia, that's all. He couldn't tell Kurt he'd been avoiding his room, the empty space next to Marcus. The guilt of his lies. He glanced to the back of the cabin and the short hallway leading to the rooms. It was hard to tell because of the shadows, but the door to the room he shared with Marcus seemed to be open a crack. I hate this snow, Kurt said, snapping shut the book and tossing it on the couch. It's as if the world's been erased. Like Barry was erased, Daniel thought. Instead, he said, it'll look beautiful in the morning. The trees, the hills, the lake. Kurt shrugged. Maybe, but I hate not being able to see where I am, to get my bearings. The two stood side by side, staring out the window at the blankness. When I was a kid, I never got lost. My friends and I would go on hikes and they'd listen to me because I always knew which way was home. But this snow, it's messing me up, like it's jamming my radar or something. It was the most he'd said all day. Daniel shifted his weight, uneasy, at Kurt's sudden garrulousness. It's just the booze, he thought. I know the lake's out there. Normally, I could point to it, even through a blizzard, and be certain that I was right. He raised his arm and straightened it like a compass needle, pointing out the window. But his arm arced back and forth uncertainly. Only now, I'm not sure. He let his arm drop. It's weird, but I get the feeling that out there is no direction. The lines on his forehead deepened. It scares me. Scared? Kurt was the last person Daniel had expected to be scared. But now that he'd said it, Daniel could see the tension in him, the rigidity of the way he held himself, almost coiled, as if preparing for flight. You'll feel better in the morning. It sounded strange to Daniel, coming out of his mouth, this attempt to comfort Kurt who'd always done the comforting. I don't want to lose the next round, Daniel. Kurt's voice was hushed. If I have to leave, I have this feeling I'll never find my way back. I know it sounds stupid. I know there's only one road out of here, but I can't shake this feeling. You won't lose. Jason will. Everyone detests him. But what if I do? Peter likes you. He wouldn't make you leave. Daniel smiled up at the big man in what he hoped was a reassuring way. Besides, he couldn't make you leave if you didn't want to. I'm not so sure. He looked at Daniel. I'm not so sure what to make of anything anymore. Kurt turned towards the fireplace. It was a moment before Daniel understood what he was staring at. The cigar box. Daniel reached up and put a hand on Kurt's broad shoulder, felt him try to suppress a twitch. Peter's cruel, but he's not crazy. Kurt shrugged away his hand. He walked over to the box and flipped open the lid. He tilted it to show it was empty. Daniel stared. Peter must have taken it, he said, not sure who. He was trying to convince. Probably put it away. Because of Jason. You know how he'd want to play with it and end up shooting himself or someone else in the foot. Guns scare the shit out of me. Kurt dropped the box back onto the mantel. The lid fell shut. So I was watching. Peter didn't go near the box. No one did, except Marcus. The wall clock ticked loudly, once, twice. You saw him take the gun. Kurt shook his head. As far as I could tell, he only looked. Relief flooded Daniel. But if he was good with his hands, like a magician or something, it felt like an icy lump had congealed in Daniel's stomach. Marcus, in an idle moment, had once shown him a parlor trick, making Daniel's comb disappear. Daniel had watched closely a second and then a third time, but couldn't tell how he'd done it. Could he have taken the gun? Christ, why would he want to take the gun? Kurt had moved over next to Daniel. His fingers circled Daniel's upper arm, thumb easily meeting forefinger. He was speaking, quietly but urgently, most of his words lost on Daniel. You know about him? What? Kurt squeezed. Daniel felt blood throbbing where fingers pressed into his flesh. Kurt leaned in until his chin almost touched Daniel's forehead. Thick fumes from the scotch curled into his nostrils, seeped into his brain. He felt drunk on Kurt's breath. Marcus, we all know you've just met him. What do you really know about him? Nothing, Daniel thought. Not a goddamn thing. Why would he want the gun? Daniel, he doesn't have the gun. You said so yourself. Maybe. Kurt darted a nervous glance around the cabin as if he was afraid Marcus had, until this moment, stood unnoticed in a corner. He lowered his voice. I know what Peter's up to. Why we're all here. He shook his head. Jesus, this is a new low, even for Peter. Daniel tried to pull away. His efforts were futile. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't give me the bullshit. His eyes blazed. It's who he wants to humiliate, Daniel. It's your lovers he's assembled. You're crazy. If Marcus were the jealous sort, his grip tightened. Daniel's eyes teared up, blood sang in his ears. Jesus, he gasped. Let go of my arm. Kurt stared at his fingers wrapped around Daniel's forearm as if he'd just become aware of them himself. He released his grip. Daniel squirmed away, headed for the bedroom on wobbly legs. For Christ's sake, he didn't take the gun, he said, over his shoulder. It's not him. He listened for the creaking of the floorboards, for Kurt's steps, but the big man didn't follow. Wait. Daniel paused, his hand on the doorknob. There was something plaintive in Kurt's voice, a tone wholly inappropriate to him. It dug into Daniel like a barbed hook. For the sake of what we once had, please don't let Peter throw me overboard. He glanced back at Kurt. The big man stood, his back to the window in the implacable snow. His shoulders slumped, arms hung at his side, fingers half curled around nothing, looking for all the world like a small, frightened boy. You're drunk. Get some sleep. Daniel pulled open the door. He stepped into the dark room, dragging the door shut behind him, and almost collided with Marcus. He caught his breath, his heart hammering wildly. Jesus, you scared me. Marcus was naked. He frowned but said nothing. Daniel's eyes adjusted. Enough light came through their uncurtained window for Daniel to make out the smooth surfaces of his body, the sinewy muscle, the flawless skin, perfect as a Greek statue. The beginning of an erection disquieted him. What was that all about? Marcus's voice was as cold as the storm outside. Nothing, Daniel answered quietly, pushing past him, the skin of his hand tingling where it brushed against the warmth of Marcus's thigh. Nothing at all. His heart still beat fiercely against his ribs. What had he heard? Daniel wondered. Could the sound of their voices have reached him? Daniel caught himself glancing at Marcus's hands, half expecting to see the gun, but his fingers were curled around nothing, forming loose fists. Daniel turned his back, felt Marcus's eyes on him as he pulled off his clothes, sharply aware of the contrast of his own body, mottled with moles and tufts of odd hair, his skin beginning its irreparable sagging. The image was like a plunge into icy water. What was left of his erection subsided. Climbing into bed, he lay on his side, his back to Marcus. For a time there was silence, then the bed creaked as Marcus settled behind him. He didn't take it, Daniel told himself. Kurt's worry about the gun was nonsense. Hell, for all he knew, Kurt had taken the gun. Or maybe it was another of Peter's mind games. Maybe he'd never really put the gun back in the box to begin with. Fingers lightly touched the hollow of Daniel's side, just below his ribs. Daniel's desire stirred. Marcus's hand drifted around to his stomach, then crept down his abdomen, fingers circling his rekindled erection. "I love you," Marcus whispered. "Do you love me?" "Yes," Daniel whispered. He shivered and closed his eyes, falling into thoughtless pleasures where words became unnecessary. Drifts had climbed the trunks of trees, wrapping around them. Like mufflers, branches hung low with their burden of snow, pristine. White blanketed the ground, an altogether beautiful winter scene, just as he'd told Kurt it would be. "He's gone," Daniel said. Martin, a chef by trade, flipped an omelet expertly. "Who's gone?" "Kurt." Rick poked tentatively at bacon with his spatula. Unlike Martin, he was useless in the kitchen. There was a time Daniel's apartment had filled with the marvelous aromas of Martin's breakfasts. Of the breakfasts they had cooked together. He missed those. But Martin had been hinting more and more strongly about his feelings for Daniel. Feelings Daniel did not reciprocate. What choice did he have? He had to break it off before it had gotten messy. An obscenely short time later, Martin and Rick started dating. Now, they were inseparable. But early in their budding relationship, out of spite at Martin's remarkable emotional resilience and with Peter's encouragement, Daniel had once seduced Rick. Since then, the small man couldn't hold Daniel's gaze without turning crimson for months after he'd clung to Martin like a frightened child in Daniel's presence. "I just assumed he got lucky." Jason leered at Daniel. He and Kurt had been sharing a room. He didn't use the bed last night. His bag is still sitting on it. Jason paused between mouthfuls of jam-smeared toast he was supposed to have been preparing for the group. Maybe he went for a walk. Martin turned his attention back to his eggs. Daniel looked outside. In the light of day, the weather didn't look nearly as bad. The tail end of the lake had become visible, where it licked the shore. "His rover is gone." In front of the cabin were two empty spots in the line of cars. Berries had filled with snow, erasing any evidence that he'd once parked there. Not so. With Kurt's thick, tumbling flakes softly rounding the edges of a recent depression, Daniel guessed he couldn't have left more than 2 hours ago. Okay, so he went for a drive. He's not coming back. Daniel turned. They all stared at him, except for Marcus, who sat alone on the couch, legs crossed, a yellowed magazine open in his lap. A vague memory plagued Daniel of Marcus sliding out of bed in the pre-dawn light, walking silently to the door of their room. Or had it been a dream? "How do you know?" Peter's question conveyed curiosity but little concern. He sat at the card table snipping slips of paper for future rounds. Next to blank ballots lay the token which they placed their votes, Peter's small nod to anonymity. He talked about it last night. Daniel imagined Kurt's rover plunging into the whiteness, the snow coagulating around him. Kurt losing himself on that lonely road. "That's odd," Jason said, nodding at the coat rack. His coat's still on the hook.